I know where we're going next in Final Fantasy XIV. Okay, I don't know. I didn't break into Yoshi P's house and rifle through his filing cabinets. But I think I've got a good idea based on the clues we've been given, and today, I'm gonna present my case. First, let's get out of the way the place we aren't going. It's not gonna be Mericidia. Look, I know we all want Mericidia, or Corvos. Trust me, I thought 7.0 was gonna be Mericidia, but instead we smiled and let the rainbow sing.
No! No!
But Yoshi P said directly in a 2025 Gamescom interview, I have already decided when Mericidia will make an appearance and how. But what I can say is that it's going to be quite a ways away. And when it comes to that point in the story, we will be facing a lot of mysteries, but it won't be soon. But I do want to express that I am thinking about it very properly and firmly. So, no Fantasy Australia for a while. But what do we know about where we're going? Well, they do like to drop us little hints, namely so far the 7.4 stinger phrase and the end of the year poem from Yoshi P himself. Let's take a look at those. Upon the completion of 7.4 Into the Mist, we get the following ominous phrase: "Whither blows fate's wandering will, for grey clouds presage winter's chill." Nice and ambiguous as always, but we can pick up a few very distinct motifs in the phrasing here. Winds, weather, travel, cold. Okay, good to know. Let's see what Yoshi P's poem says. "Our past astern we scan the sea, in search of that which may yet be. Frail playthings of the restless tide, yet wind and wave shall be our guide." Astern, the sea, restless tide, wind and wave. Now we're just doubling down on this nautical theming then? Seeking new horizons on the open waters, visiting shape-shifting islands that conceal 6th era ruins. We've also been hearing a lot about these mysterious winterers and a pretty consistent emphasis on the Milala who fled from a calamity of ice from... Okay, I've heard enough. I know where we're going next. In the 874th year of the 6th astral era, a group of weathered sailors arrived from the northern Empty aboard a mighty longship called the Galadian. This sturdy tribe, the last vestige of a mighty armada that fled a failed rebellion against a tyrant king, would go on to help establish one of Eorzea's great city-states, Limsa Lominsa. These are the Rogadin, who would come to be known as the Sea Wolves, and the land they left behind is known as Aerslaent. Aerslaent, meaning First Land, is an archipelago far to the north of Old Charlayan, in the desolate sea known as the Northern Empty. This is the homeland of the Rogadin. By all accounts, it is an ancient land, and perhaps even the origin of civilization itself. From the trolls, the longships, the raiding culture, the northern climates, we can conclude that Aerslaent is Atheris' equivalent of the North European Nordic nations. Now, you can probably see the dots I've connected to arrive at my conclusion, but I'll spell it out for you anyway. Between the messages of winds blowing fate and wandering wills of the 7.4 reveal and the rampant nautical terminology in Yoshi P's poem, I think it's pretty safe to say that they are hinting heavily at some manner of sea travel. And that places the Viking-inspired Aerslaent as my prime suspect for where we're going in 8.0. It does go deeper than this, however. When we look at the different translations of Yoshi P's poem, the nuances of different languages can further inform and contextualize what the meaning of the poem is intended to be. In the Japanese version, we are told, "The waves are the rhythm of tradition, and the wind is the momentum of henkaku." Henkaku is a Japanese term that primarily signifies a significant foundational change, but it can also represent a dramatic shift such as revolution, irregularity, or decline. The German translation, again full of nautical and ship terminology, mentions the winds locked mit Zeitenumbruch, or beckoning times of change. Looking deeper at the German word Umbruch, it is not simply change, however, but radical change, upheaval even. So one thing is consistent here: change is coming, and it will be significant. Now, one thing is also clear from a meta perspective, Dawntrail left a lot of people with a less than favorable opinion of Final Fantasy XIV as a whole, and a lot of the cracks in the foundation are beginning to show. Yoshi P has not been subtle about being acutely aware of this, and ready to move forward with the changes that Final Fantasy XIV needs to make in order to thrive. So I do think that these hints towards change and upheaval have a meta component to them, promising dramatic gameplay changes. But seeing as how a word can mean two different things, and if Yoshi P's history of crazy apparel is any indication, the man is good at entendre. We really don't know a lot about Aerslaent's culture, but there's one thing we do know, and that is that its leadership has historically been far less agreeable than our friends in Tyrol. Their governing body has been described as tyrants, suggesting a strict and cruel authoritarian presence up north. One that the ancestors of our modern Rogadin fought and failed to overthrow. If the winds of fate are blowing us northward to Aerslaent, and it still finds itself in the grips of such a regime, it is within our purview as the Warrior of Light and bearer of Azem's crystal to bring necessary freedom and change to the beleaguered peoples. Besides, what better contrast would there be to our recent diplomatic successes in Tyrol than squaring off with a demonstrably cruel and ruthless dictator? For indeed, the shoe puff in the room is that Dawntrail's story simply didn't resonate as heavily with as many people as we've come to grow used to.
I must stress how ridiculous it is that this is the song that plays while we build a bomb.
There are a lot of reasons for this, enough to fill an entirely different video, and also a topic that has been discussed to death. But for our sake, I want to focus on the lack of bite. Final Fantasy XIV and Final Fantasy at large have always danced on the razor's edge between significantly dramatic and tremendously unserious. Final Fantasy XIV has carried that balance admirably over many expansions, balancing heavy stakes and real-world analogs with silly cat girls and corn servants. And although I think Dawntrail's story, while underwhelming, is a little bit too heavily criticized, I do think it came off as a little bit too soft and solved. A gritty, dangerous setting in a land we know very little about, ruled by an oppressive, authoritarian regime at the height of its power, it's an excellent way to correct the stakes. The final piece of evidence I feel may point to Aerslaent being our next destination is everyone's favorite Giga Chad Rogadin uncle. Introduced in Dawntrail, Kettenram Blaufisten is a legendary Rogadin sailor and explorer. Kettenram wouldn't be our first major NPC introduced in an expansion only to be summarily discarded at the onset of our next adventure, but it's definitely worth noting that Creative Studio 3 went out of their way to give Kettenram a unique facial model. He is also our primary point of contact in the Occult Crescent, further cementing his importance in the narrative. If we're going to the tumultuous and dangerous Rogadin homeland by way of the open sea, doesn't it stand to reason that the recently befriended legendary Rogadin sailor with a unique character model might play some sort of role? With every new expansion we get a set of new jobs, and I have no reason to believe that 8.0 will be any different. So, if we're going to Aerslaent, then what might the jobs be? Well, for starters, it's worth admitting that the jobs released in any given expansion aren't necessarily tied to the location we're traveling. After all, Pictomancer doesn't really have a lot to do with Mesoamerica, but it does seem like they at least make an effort to theme it, such as with Stormblood Samurai and Endwalker's Reaper. The second point worth mentioning is that Yoshi P has mused on the possibility that design space has been used up for all the traditional or legacy Final Fantasy jobs, so there's no guarantee that future jobs must adhere to this legacy. However, honoring the Final Fantasy series is obviously critical to Final Fantasy XIV's identity, and I don't think it's something this team is excited to abandon, so if they can use legacy jobs, I think they will. Which is why I've chosen to focus on 3 potential legacy jobs that we could see. The last point is something we can be at least a little more confident on, and that is that we are due for a new tank job and a new ranged physical DPS job. With that in mind, the first potential job for an Aerslaent expansion would be Viking. With only Final Fantasy III as its mainline appearance, Viking is one of the lesser-known Final Fantasy jobs, only showing up in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance 2 and a handful of smaller spin-offs otherwise. This is likely because Viking is, frankly, kind of a mundane job. It lacks much of a unique identity, simply being a beefy, tanky melee job. However, that lack of any meaningful flavor in its previous iterations is not something that would stop Creative Studio 3 from bringing us an interesting new job design. After all, the only Pictomancer we have in the series is Realm, and her sketch ability in Final Fantasy VI was kinda garbage. If they can turn that into the amazing job we got in Dawntrail, I think they could come up with something for Viking. Envisioning the class as something that perhaps dual wields one-handed axes, Viking would be a perfect fit for our new tank. There is, of course, the concern that a job like Viking would overlap significantly with Warrior, but I think there is enough design space to differentiate the stout heart and pillaging nature of a Viking with the bloodlust berserker aesthetic that Final Fantasy XIV's Warrior has claimed. The second job is one that has frequently been mentioned as a possibility, and one that many had thought we would get in Dawntrail, only for that job to end up being Viper. With the promise of a new ranged physical DPS on the horizon, however, I think it's time at last for Corsair to make its way to Final Fantasy XIV. I envision this class as a dual pistol-wielding freebooter, a swashbuckler with panache, whose privateer spirit reflects the nautical flair that an Aerslaent expansion would bring. Corsair has only ever featured as a job once in the history of Final Fantasy, but the precedent is notable, as it appeared in Final Fantasy XIV's predecessor MMO, Final Fantasy XI. Despite that being Corsair's only iteration, the mechanics behind the class are well ingrained in Final Fantasy's legacy. A Corsair job would serve as a gambler job as well, an RNG-based class that has appeared in many Final Fantasies, such as 6, 7, 8, 10, and 10-2. The last job is a weird one, but I feel like it fits the nautical theming and the brutish Rogadin theming. The Cannoneer. The Cannoneer is an artillery-based ranged damage class that first appeared in the Game Boy Advance remake of Final Fantasy V, and later featured again in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance 2. Like Viking, Cannoneer is a bit of a black sheep job. And like Viking, the reason for this is its inherent lackluster and somewhat dull playstyle. It is, however, undeniable that the job fantasy of using a shoulder-mounted freaking cannon is extremely cool, and I personally believe that such a bulky, sturdy aesthetic not only lends itself well as a possible ranged physical DPS candidate, but also perhaps even an unlikely candidate for our tank. A ranged tank? I'm sure they could pull it off. Now, let's step back into talking about our destination. As cool as Aerslaent would be, I don't think it's enough to carry an entire expansion on its own. However, we have a rich history of going to two places in two acts of an expansion, with examples like Stormblood's Garabania and Othard, as well as Endwalker's globetrotting from Thavnair to Sharlayan to Garlemald. So I think it's safe to assume Aerslaent is only half the story. So where else could we be going? Unlike my certainty in Aerslaent, I feel like the second location is much more fluid, so much so that I can envision 5 distinct possibilities. First of all is the popular guess that you've probably seen a million thumbnails for already, Blind Frost. These are the scattered Arctic islands north of Othard, and according to Emmett Selk, may or may not be chock full of treasure for some reason. There really isn't a lot in the lore to support what exactly goes on in Blind Frost, but that just means it's a blank canvas for the world-building team. It could be possible we need to get there, and attempt to travel there by way of Aerslaent, only to be stopped and rerouted by another means, which is to say, our second potential location. The rest of Othard. Back in Stormblood, we knocked out a fair chunk of Othard with the Ruby Sea, Yangsha, Kugane, Doma, and the Azim Steppe. However, there is a lot of Othard left, even without touching the southern reaches of Nagxia, Valnain, Greylex Bend, and a return trip to Dalmasca. We still have locations such as the Riat-Gir Peninsula and Dalvalan Grath, and of course the rest of the island nation of Hingashi, including its capital of Bukyo. Why we would go there is anyone's guess, honestly. but it could serve as a potential staging grounds if our initial trip to Aerslaent is an attempt to head further north. Our third potential location is a bit closer to Aerslaent and one that a lot of people have been clamoring for. With Aerslaent serving as our first hub city, perhaps our second will be an expanded Garlemald, with a portion of the continent of Ilsabard finally opening up for our exploration. This is, again, following the idea that our ultimate goal will be somewhere in the north, either the Blind Frost or Nagyn. We'll get to that in a minute. Garlemald is conveniently located for just such a staging ground, and although it looks like the capital city may be landlocked, a former global world power such as the Garlean Empire certainly must have a port town nearby. Let's hope for Junon. Despite all this, I honestly don't think Ilsabard is one of the more likely potentials. I think Ilsabard is large enough to serve as its own expansion altogether. Also, if we don't go to Corvus when we finally visit Ilsabard, I think there might be a riot. The last two are a little more out there, and I really can't connect them to Aerslaent in a meaningful way, but they've been very present in the story lately, so they're worth throwing out there. The first is the South Sea Isles, which is another location mentioned in Emmett Selk's checklist alongside Blindfrost. Now, yes, technically we have been to the South Sea Isles by way of Alo Alo Island. However, South Sea Isles is plural. There's ostensibly way more out there than what we've seen, and taking into consideration its value as the ancestral homeland of the Milala, whose origins have been discussed repeatedly in the recent narrative, it may be hinting at a tropical destination in addition to our chilly location of Aerslaent. It's also important to note that the Milala deeply revered a certain artifact that has emerged as the big question mark in the narrative, and the thing that is likely going to be our primary thrust of the story moving forward, the Interdimensional Key. It's very possible the ancient Milala had more information on this artifact, information that we are going to need to better understand it. Finally, the last possibility is really out there, literally. Speaking of the Interdimensional Key, it's possible our connection as Azem may serve as a shortcut to understanding it, and we'll be off to the races, heading back into interplanar travel. It certainly seems like this is where the story is ultimately headed, and we have a handful of reflections that, as far as we know, are still intact, namely the 4th, the 8th, and the 11th. The 9th is another possibility, as patch 7.4 has showed us that people yet live there in the dark city of Treno. Wherever we end up going with our interdimensional key, I do hope that at least part of our mission is finding a solution for those beleaguered inhabitants of the 9th, in addition to the ruined vestiges of what was once the 13th. No matter what, I do think that one location that will play an important role, and one that may even wind up being our final zone, is the mysterious island called Nagyn. We know precious little about this island, but Encyclopedia Eorzea does go out of its way to let us know that the Rogadin believe it to be the point of origin for the rest of the entire world. Indeed, Nagyn itself is the Rogadin word for origin. Whether those legends are true or not, a location with that much mystery and pomp and circumstance has to be a consequential location. It doesn't match up geographically for where we believe them to be, but I'd love it if Nagyn may be the source location of the ruins of Amarad. Another place my mind goes is that in Final Fantasy XVI, another project developed by Creative Studio 3, the final dungeon was also called Origin, and the boss of that dungeon was none other than an alien entity known as Ultima. And we may or may not still have an omnipotent, extra-dimensional cosmic horror floating around in between dimensions that we're still going to have to deal with sooner or later. But that's a conversation for another time. I appreciate you taking the time out to listen to why we're going to Aerslaent, and honestly, I'm just excited for our next adventure, whether that's going to be to Aerslaent, or Ilsabard, or Blindfrost, or the reflections beyond our own. But it's going to be Aerslaent.